Long before the modern world took shape, Egypt stood as the first true superpower of human history. It was the land of pharaohs, a civilization so dominant that its influence echoed across continents. About this very Egypt, the Prophet Muhammad gave a clear instruction before his passing. He said that Muslims would one day conquer Egypt. But when that day came, they must treat its people with kindness, because they were connected by ties of kinship. Not long after the Prophet left this world, Muslims, under the leadership of Umar ibn al-Khattab, defeated the Roman and Persian empires and took control of vast territories. But just as these lands were conquered, a severe and deadly plague spread rapidly across the region. The Muslim advance slowed, and many of their greatest generals were martyred. This sudden loss opened the way for new leaders to rise. Umar appointed fresh commanders, and among them, Amr ibn al-As was made the new army chief. As Amr ibn al-As took command, the plague gradually faded. When news reached Umar in Medina, he personally set out to assess the situation. Before leaving, he entrusted the governance of Medina and the entire Arabian region to Ali ibn Abi Talib, meaning that if anything were to happen to Umar on this journey, Ali would automatically become the new caliph of the empire. When Umar reached Syria, he met Amr ibn al-As, who presented him with a bold idea. Instead of pausing, he suggested moving toward an entirely new world, Egypt, and Egypt was no ordinary land. For thousands of years, it had been among the richest regions on earth, its power mentioned repeatedly in the Quran. But how did Egypt become so powerful in the first place? 5,000 years ago, the world revolved around a single resource, water. Whoever controlled the most water controlled the world. And from that ancient time until today, the greatest river on earth flowed through Egypt, the Nile. Slowly, people from across the world settled along its banks. The fertility of the land turned Egypt into the most powerful and wealthy civilization of its era. From among these people rose a man named King Narmer, who unified Upper and Lower Egypt and established the world's first known monarchy. Though this happened 5,000 years, we know it today because of two ancient stone tablets, the earliest examples of Egyptian writing, where King Narmer can still be clearly seen. Over the next 1,000 years, Egypt ruled the known world. After centuries of dominance, the pharaohs became convinced that no power existed above them. For the first time in history, a ruler did not merely claim kingship, but declared himself a god. A religion was formed where Pharaoh was worshipped as a deity, and the people were told they could only attain salvation by remaining loyal slaves to their god-king. Over time, this belief evolved further. It was decided that not every pharaoh was divine. Only the one whose body remained perfectly preserved after death would retain godhood forever. This sparked a strange competition among pharaohs to preserve their bodies, leading to the invention of mummification. When a pharaoh died, surgeons removed his blood, extracted his brain through the nose using hooks, and took out all internal organs except the heart, which was preserved separately. The body was treated with special salts for 40 days, then filled with sand to maintain its shape. Oils and honey were applied, and the body was wrapped in white linen before being sealed inside an expensive coffin, buried with food, gold, and the preserved heart. What began as an experiment became tradition. Eventually, pharaohs went beyond mummies and began building massive structures over their tombs. These structures grew larger with every generation, giving birth to the pyramids. Each pharaoh wanted his pyramid to surpass the last. This ambition reached its peak with Pharaoh Khufu, whose pyramid became the largest structure on earth, a record it held for over Wubak years. Even today, its sheer weight surpasses modern skyscrapers. Yet, These monumental constructions drained Egypt's wealth. Slowly, the economy weakened, and for the first time, Egypt's status as a superpower began to crumble. It was during this decline that a young slave boy was sold in the markets of Egypt. Unlike the others, his beauty and character stood out. He was adopted by a powerful minister and would later rise to become Yusuf, the prime minister of Egypt. Through wisdom and planning, Yusuf restored Egypt's economy and turned it into a superpower once again. After his passing, the descendants of Yusuf, Bani Israel, settled in Egypt and gradually became influential. But when their power peaked, a new pharaoh seized control, destroyed the old dynasty, and enforced harsh policies against foreigners. Bani Israel were enslaved for 400 years, clinging to one hope that a prophet would come to free them. That prophecy began to unfold when astrologers warned Pharaoh that a child from Bani Israel would destroy his empire. Terrified, Pharaoh ordered all newborn boys to be killed. Yet the child they feared, Musa, survived and was raised in Pharaoh's own palace. When Musa was chosen as a prophet, he demanded the freedom of Bani Israel. After many miracles, Pharaoh agreed, only to break his promise and chase them with his army. At the edge of the sea, Allah saved Musa and his people and drowned Pharaoh and his forces, ending 3,000 years of arrogance in a single moment. Though Egyptian records remain silent about Musa, historians agree on one truth. After the death of Ramses, Egypt never regained its former power. The illusion of godhood shattered, and Egypt entered a long decline known as the Dark Ages. One empire after another rose and fell, until finally the Roman Empire ruled Egypt for 600 years. At this point, Egypt was no longer the untouchable superpower it once had been. 6 centuries of Roman rule had drained its wealth, weakened its spirit, and turned its people into subjects rather than rulers of their own destiny. Heavy taxes crushed the farmers of the Nile. Churches backed by imperial power enforced religious control, and the common people lived between poverty and fear. Egypt still carried the weight of its glorious past, but its soul was exhausted. It was into this exhausted land that Amr ibn al-As marched, not as a conqueror driven by greed, but as a commander carrying a promise made by the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. His army was small compared to the Roman forces, lacking wealth, weapons, and numbers, yet it carried something the Romans did not: unshakable faith and a clear sense of purpose. Step by step, city by city, the Muslims advanced, facing fortresses that had stood for centuries and armies trained to defend an empire. The Romans relied on walls, numbers, and fear. The Muslims relied on discipline, justice, and trust in Allah. Battles were fought, treaties were signed, and wherever the Muslim army entered, the local population began to notice something unfamiliar. No forced conversions, no destruction of homes, no humiliation of civilians. Churches remained standing, property was protected, and people were judged not by their beliefs, but by their actions. Slowly, the people of Egypt began to realize that these newcomers were different from every ruler they had known before. For generations, they had been crushed under pharaohs who claimed godhood, emperors who demanded worship, and governors who saw Egypt only as a source of grain and gold. Now they saw leaders who walked among their soldiers, shared their food, and spoke of accountability before one God. When news reached Umar ibn al-Khattab in Medina, he watched the events carefully. He reminded his commanders again and again of the Prophet's words about Egypt, instructing them to protect its people and honor their rights. For Umar, Egypt was not just another territory, it was a trust. As the Roman grip weakened, one fortress after another fell, not merely through force, but through endurance. Years passed in struggle, patience, and negotiation, until at last the heart of Roman Egypt stood exposed. The land that had once bowed before pharaohs, emperors, and false gods was now witnessing the rise of a new kind of rule, one that did not claim divinity, but servitude to Allah alone. And as Egypt prepared to step into a new chapter of its history, a chapter written not with crowns and idols, but with justice and responsibility, the question remained whether this land, so long defined by power, pride, and downfall, was finally about to find a balance it had never known before. For the first time in centuries, Egypt was not being pulled into another empire for its wealth, its grain, or its strategic position. Instead, it was being invited into a system where rulers were answerable, power was limited, and leadership was seen as a burden rather than a privilege. This idea alone was more shocking to the people of Egypt than any army could ever be. When Alexandria, the crown jewel of Roman Egypt, finally opened its gates, the world quietly shifted. A city that had been ruled by Greeks, Romans, and emperors who never truly belonged to it, now passed into Muslim hands. Yet there were no celebrations of arrogance, no mass punishments, no forced changes. Amr ibn Alas ensured that agreements were honored exactly as promised. Lives were protected, churches were secured, and taxes were reduced to levels the people could actually bear. News of this governance spread faster than the army itself. Villages along the Nile began welcoming Muslim administrators not with fear, but with relief. Farmers kept the fruits of their labor, traders found fairness in markets, and ordinary people experienced something Egypt had rarely known: stability without humiliation. Slowly, trust replaced suspicion. Under Muslim rule, Egypt's greatest strength, the Nile, was once again managed with care. Irrigation systems were restored, agriculture revived, and famine was prevented through planning rather than exploitation. Egypt did not regain its ancient status as a world-dominating superpower, but it gained something far more lasting: dignity. Years later, when famine struck Medina during the Year of Ashes, it was Egypt that answered the call. Under the leadership of Amr ibn al-As, massive caravans of grain traveled from Egypt to Arabia, saving countless lives. The land that had once enslaved prophets was now feeding the city of the prophet. This transformation was not sudden, nor was it magical. It was the result of a complete shift in values. Transformation was not sudden, nor was it magical. It was the result of a complete shift in values. Egypt had been destroyed time and again by rulers who believed they were gods, kings who believed power belonged to them by birth, and empires that saw people as tools. Now it was governed by men who believed power belonged only to Allah, and that every human being, ruler or ruled, would stand equally accountable one day. Centuries passed, dynasties changed, and history continued its relentless flow. Egypt would face new challenges, new rulers, and new trials. But something had permanently changed deep within its story. The land that once crowned men as gods had learned, through rise and collapse, through arrogance and humility, that no empire survives and no power lasts without truth. From the banks of the Nile to the halls of pharaohs, from pyramids built on pride to empires drowned by arrogance, Egypt's story is not just the story of a land. It is the story of human power tested by time. Every civilization that rose believing itself eternal eventually faced the same truth. Strength without humility leads only to destruction. Pharaohs claimed divinity and were erased by water. Empires ruled with iron and collapsed under their own weight. Wealth, armies, monuments, and names carved in stone could not save those who forgot their limits. Yet when justice, mercy, and accountability entered this land, Egypt did not shine through fear, it endured through balance. The Quran reminds us again and again to travel through the earth and reflect on what happened to those before us. Egypt stands as a living lesson, written not in words, but in ruins, rivers, and memories. It teaches us that Allah alone grants honor, and when He takes it away, no army, no wall, and no crown can protect it. Today, the pyramids still stand, not as symbols of godhood, but as silent witnesses. Witnesses to the rise of arrogance, the fall of tyranny, and the unstoppable march of truth. Egypt remains, not because pharaohs were divine, but because Allah's plan is perfect, unfolding across centuries in ways no ruler can control. And as we look back at this land that once ruled the world, one question remains for every heart that listens to history. Will we learn from the past, or repeat it in a new form?